Good afternoon. My name is Glenn Most, and I'm honored to be invited by the Scuola Archeologica Italiana di Atene to participate in the celebrations in honor of the 700th anniversary of the death of one of Europe's greatest poets, Dante Alighieri. I wrote some years ago an article on the subject of Dante and his Greeks, and I am delighted to have been given the opportunity to revisit that article in the light of further reflections and in the light of a new publication, which has been recently appeared. This is us. This is the new publication by Jan Żołkowski, a very interesting and helpful collection of essays. Back when I wrote my article, there was nothing or almost nothing on the subject, and now there's this splendid book. And now I will begin with my own lecture. I begin with a small question about a short text of Dante's, which will open out onto larger questions that will traverse all of the poet's works, and in the end will reach down to the deepest level of his self-understanding that we can hope to approach. This is one of Dante's sonnets. Un dì si venne a me malinconia, e disse, io voglio un poco stare teco, e parve me che la menasse seco dolore e ira per sua compagnia. E io le dissi, partiti, va via, ed ella mi rispose come un greco. E ragionando a grande agio meco, guardai e vidi amore che venia vestito di nuovo d'un drappo nero e nel suo capo portava un cappello, e certo lacrimava pur di vero. Ed io gli dissi, che hai cattivello? Ed el rispose, eo ho guai pensiero, che nostro don amor, dolce fratello. We can understand in very general terms, in our own very general terms, what is happening in the situation imagined by this poem. If we were to try to explain it in a language familiar to us, we might say that one day Dante, without knowing precisely why, started to feel depressed. His inexplicable depression continued, and he started to feel the first vague beginnings of something like grief and anger. Who amongst us has not experienced such days on occasion? But then Dante's account takes a surprising turn. Suddenly, he recalled his love for Beatrice, and on that basis, he recognized within himself a deep anxiety that she might be dying. So we might conclude, after all, it was this that was the reason for his strange mood in the first place. There are many things that one could say about this poem, but I would like to begin by posing what could seem a very small question. Why does Dante say that melancholy answers the speaker come un greco, like a Greek? Our first impulse might be to think that she speaks to him in the Greek language. Is this not, after all, how Greeks talk? But this is obviously not right. Melancholy's name, to be sure, is Greek, and as such, it stands out starkly against the Latin-Italian context of the rest of the poem. Yet Melancholy had spoken her first words to the poet in Italian, io voglio un poco stare teco. And no reason is given, nor can one be supplied, for why she might have chosen suddenly to switch languages. Nor, for that matter, is there any indication that if she had suddenly started speaking in Greek, the poet would have been able to understand a single word she said to him. So although Greek is the name of a people and of their language, and although Dante applies the term to a verbal action on the part of Melancholy, ella mi rispose, we must presumably take the term to refer not to the particular language in which that action was performed, but rather to some other quality of that verbal action, which may be thought to be characteristic of that people. Which quality? Most commentaries on this poem explain that what Dante means is that the Greeks are typically haughty and arrogant, so that Melancholy, in answering him like a Greek, would be answering disdainfully. Now, this may well be true about the Greeks, or about the Greeks as Dante and his readers saw them, but it must be acknowledged that nothing whatsoever in the poem itself authorizes us to think here of Melancholy as being particularly proud or arrogant. To be sure, she continues speaking even though Dante tells her to leave, but we can imagine many reasons she might choose to do this other than arrogance. For example, cruelty, or stubbornness, or laziness, or deafness. And it is not clear, at least not from this poem, in what sense her manner of responding might itself meaningfully be described as being arrogant. So this line raises a question for us. What does Dante mean when he says that Melancholy answered like a Greek? But the immediate context, the poem in which it is found, does not seem to provide us sufficient information for answering it. We must cast our hermeneutic net more widely and must ask, in order to find out how Dante can think that Melancholy answered like Greek, a more general question. Who are the Greeks for Dante? For those of us who work professionally on Greek culture, the Greeks are a historical people. Just as they occupy a determinate space on the map of the world, so too they are located within a determinate time in the chronology of the world. There were ancient Greeks and medieval Greeks. There were and are modern Greeks. In some sense, though this is not entirely free of difficulties, they have all been Greeks. For Dante, on the contrary, the Greeks were essentially not a historical people, but a moral and aesthetic one. He is certainly capable, at least on occasion, of assigning events of ancient Greek history to a more or less precise position within a rough chronological framework. But this is not the rule, but the exception. Usually, the Greeks are defined for Dante by the various places they occupy in the moral and aesthetic structure of the world, and their historical aspects are merely secondary and largely uninteresting. I say places, not place, for in different perspectives, the positions which the Greeks occupy in Dante's world are very different from one another. This becomes clear when we consider Dante's Greeks in terms of language, of history, of philosophy, and of mythology and poetry. I begin with language. In De Vulgari Eloquentia 1:8, Dante divides the whole linguistic world that he knows of into three large areas. These are what he calls the Greeks, corresponding to the Byzantine Empire at the eastern edge of Europe and in Asia, what he does not name with a single term, but what we might call Germanic, all of Eastern and Northern Europe up to the borders of Hungary, and what we would term Romance, Italy, Provence, and France. As is clear from many indications, this is not really a classification in terms of historical linguistics, but in terms of geographical distribution. Thus, the language spoken by the Greeks, according to Dante, would seem to be what he supposes to be the common national idiom of the contemporary Byzantines, which he probably thought was identical with the language of the ancient Greeks. Dante never expresses any desire to learn this idiom, nor any regret that he is unable to do so. Although a number of Greek philosophical texts have been translated into Latin in Sicily in the middle of the 13th century, and although the Byzantine and Western worlds were linked in Dante's time by various kinds of commercial, diplomatic, and religious ties, it never seems even to occur to Dante that one might learn the Greek language. The difference in this regard between Dante and later Petrarch and Boccaccio is striking. In summary, we might say that neither in its ancient version nor in its Byzantine one is the Greek language an active and vitally interesting part of Dante's linguistic world. He knows that it exists, but he sees no reason to wish to learn it, nor any way to go about doing so. Its existence is a matter of indifference to him. History. According to Dante, the ancient Greeks have a specific place within the providential history of the world. In De Monarchia, Dante explains at length God's plan for the world, according to which Rome was intended to have imperium, empire, over the whole world, so that Christianity could triumph within it. The peace and power of Augustus's Rome are the evidence for God's having chosen Rome for this holy purpose. And it is, of course, no accident that it was just then that Jesus was born. In summary, we might say that for Dante, the ancient Greeks were pagan competitors against Christian Rome, who had to be defeated by providence so that Rome and Christianity could one day prevail. Philosophy. For Dante, philosophy is above all a Greek activity, and it is of fundamental importance to him. He does on occasion quote a few Latin philosophers, especially Cicero, Boethius, and Thomas Aquinas, and some Arabic commentators on Aristotle. And he does refer with respect to other Greek philosophers and natural scientists, particularly Plato's Timaeus, Ptolemy, and Galen. But above all, it is Aristotle who embodies philosophy for Dante. So much so, indeed, that he only rarely calls him by name, preferring to designate him as philosophos, or lo filosofo. According to the Convivio, Aristotle is lo maestro della nostra vita, the teacher of our life. And a whole chapter of that work, 4:6, is devoted to the careful and extended proof that Aristotle is of all people most worthy of belief and obedience. In the Inferno, Aristotle is referred to as il maestro di coloro che sanno, the teacher of those who know. In fact, in this passage, Dante does not even bother to use Aristotle's name at all in order to designate him. In summary, we might say that for Dante, Aristotle is not so much a Greek philosopher as rather philosophy itself, tout court. Aristotle is for Dante the name for a collection of useful sentences which represent the pinnacle of human reason taught by nature and not by faith. Hence, they coincide almost always with the truth of revelation and can be used rhetorically to lend authority to his own arguments. Finally, myth and poetry. In Dante's view, as in that of most of his contemporaries, ancient poetry is either history, Virgil's Aeneid, most of Lucan, much of Statius, or else it is myth, Ovid's Metamorphoses. The history, when it does not happen to be an error, is true, in that it is a correct account of human events. The myths are not at all true literally, but only allegorically. In general, Dante knows nothing whatsoever about Greek poetry and myth except what Latin authors tell him. It is symbolically quite appropriate that Dante's conversation with the Homeric hero Ulysses in Canto 26 of the Inferno will take place entirely through the mediation of the Latin poet Virgil. In the Inferno, Homer walks in front of the Latin hexameter poets and carries a sword, not because he writes about war, for some of them do that too, but rather as an expression of his dominion over them. Yet the Homer that Dante quotes, he derives from other authors, usually Aristotle in Latin, sometimes Cicero. In one passage of the Vita Nuova, chapter 25, he suggests that there might possibly have been some form of love poetry in the Greek language, but he does not know for sure and has no idea what it might have been like. Dante seems to be firmly convinced of the aesthetic value of Greek poetry, of which, in fact, he knows nothing whatsoever. Thus, in the Vita Nuova, chapter 2, when he wants to indicate how beautiful Beatrice seemed to him, he can find no greater praise for her than a line from Homer. Yet Dante derives this line from Aristotle. In summary, we might say that for Dante, Greek poetry is surpassingly beautiful, but entirely inaccessible. And Greek myth is only true, allegorically, if it is true at all. Dante admires Greek poetry not because he knows it, but because it is admired by Latin authorities whom he knows and admires. In short, we may summarize Dante's general view of the Greeks as follows. In his eyes, some peoples of the world play no role in God's plan, and so can simply be ignored. These are the barbarians of Asia and Africa. Dante simplifies matters for himself by supposing that the southern hemisphere of the world is entirely uninhabited. Other peoples are defined in essence religiously. These are the three peoples of the book, the Hebrews, the Christians, and the Muslims, all understood in contrast with one another. Finally, some other peoples are defined by their place within the scheme of providential history. These are the Greeks and the Romans, once again seen as opposed to one another. As for Greek haughtiness or arrogance, there's not a single passage anywhere in Dante's works that indicates that he might have viewed them in this light. It is striking that there are virtually no references in any of Dante's writings to the contemporary Byzantine Greek world, except with regard to questions of language, and that even these are found only very rarely indeed. Dante knows that the Byzantine Greeks exist, but he has no interest whatsoever in them. Instead, the Greeks are for Dante essentially an ancient people. They belong not to the present, but to the past. They are a people who have produced unsurpassed poetry and philosophy, and that is a very good thing. But they are also a pagan people who have been excluded from God's providential design for the world, and that is not at all a good thing. The whole problem of Dante's Greeks may be said to reside in the relation between these two aspects. These very general considerations provide a context for understanding the places occupied by the Greeks in Dante's most important and massive work, the Divina Commedia. In the very beginning of that work, the Greeks, like the Muses, are absent significantly. But already shortly afterwards, they make their first appearance, and they remain an important presence throughout the rest of the Commedia. Dante first catches sight of them in the fourth canto in Limbo. Here, the ancient Greeks appear, together with some Romans and even with a couple of Arabs, in a form characteristic for their mode of presentation in the Commedia as a whole, namely as a list of names. In all these paratactically composed lists, every single name is famous to Dante and to the readers for whom he wrote. Each one is immediately recognizable, for it functions as a sign which points directly to a well-known story. And each such story is usually the expression of a particular moral vice or virtue which indicates indubitably the essential truth of that person and the ultimate significance of his or her vicissitudes. Dante, who for his whole life has only heard about these figures indirectly, is astonished and fascinated to be able finally to see them directly in the Inferno. Although these lists tend to contain mostly Greek names, Roman names are usually found in them as well. In moral terms, Dante does not always make a sharp distinction between the Greeks and the Romans. After all, ancient Greece was mediated to him entirely by Latin authors, and a systematic contrast between Greeks and Romans did not become conventional until the second half of the 18th century. If, in the context of providential history, the Romans are identified with Christianity and are differentiated from the pagan Greeks, in these moral contexts, the Greeks and Romans together represent a pagan world, which is earlier than Christian revelation. The Romans can be pagans in some contexts, Christians in others. The Greeks are always pagans for Dante. They are the pagans' pagans. Because these Greeks, figures of myth and of history, are the most direct and unadulterated expressions of a specific vice or virtue, and because they are so famous, they have a paradigmatic status. They embody and define that moral quality with absolute clarity. As it were, they function like laboratory specimens, remarkable for their purity and hence useful for understanding the other, less simple situations we keep confronting in ordinary life. One of Dante's favorite tactics is to pair one ancient Greek with one contemporary figure. So Eurypylus and Michele Scotto in Inferno 20, or Mira and Gianni Schicchi in Inferno 30. The most amusing such pair are Sinon of Troy and Master Adam in Inferno 30, who end up thwacking one another like Punch and Judy, much to Dante's entertainment. In such cases, the ancient figure explains and dignifies the modern one. Dante seems to be saying that his age too has its villains who are not unworthy to be put alongside their most celebrated predecessors. We may interpret the ancient figure as the ultimate source for the poetic inspiration, by means of which Dante succeeded in conceptualizing the modern figure, whom he will have experienced directly or indirectly in his own life, but only been able to understand satisfactorily by correlating him with the ancient paradigm. Of course, Dante's elevation of his own modernity is bitterly ironic. What is involved are invariably not saints, but sinners. Dante is also fond of explaining something which he sees or experiences during his journey by saying that it was like something that happened once in ancient Greek myth or history. Thereby, he lends clarity and nobility to his own story, elevating it above the level of being a merely personal event and making its general import clear for the reader. Very often, such analogies take on a particularly incisive form. Dante suggests that something that happened in ancient Greece was not greater than or not different from something he himself has now seen. In this case, the ancient grandeur, the very limit of human imagination, seems to have established a boundary which, distant though it is, Dante himself has succeeded in reaching in the course of his extraordinary voyage. Against expectation, the Greek paradigm is, after all, not more perfect than his own experience. An analogy of this sort serves to communicate not only a determinate moral content, but also a supreme degree of enhancement. And finally, there's an especially noteworthy series of passages in which Dante asserts that his experience surpasses, is greater than, some celebrated event from Greek antiquity. He summons all the ancient paradigms to the reader's imagination, only so as to reject them, one after the other, as inadequate to his personal experience. Familiarity with pagan antiquity serves in this case to provide models of explanation that are useful precisely because they fail to explain the extraordinary nature of Dante's modern experience. To estimate the greatness of his own Christian achievement, Dante knows of no greater measure than pagan antiquity surpassed. The most celebrated Greek in the Commedia is Ulysses in Inferno 26. A huge bibliography of scholarship and criticism has accumulated around this canto, and there are important chapters on it in the book by Zhilkowsky that I showed you at the beginning. In the present context, I wish to draw attention above all to one important aspect of it, which surprisingly has been relatively neglected, namely Ulysses' Greekness. All the complexities of Dante's Greeks are concentrated into the figure of Dante's Ulysses. The intensity with which all their positive and negative features are brought into play with one another in this one hero makes him as ambiguous as he is unforgettable. Dante knew, of course, who Ulysses was, but he appears to have had no idea how Ulysses' story had ended. For it so happened that Dante's Latin sources brought Ulysses to that stage of the Homeric account at which he left Circe, but then broke off and said nothing more about what happened to him afterwards. No doubt this is a simple matter of chance, though it is hard to resist wondering what deeper cultural reasons may have made ancient Roman authors less interested in the events on Phaeacia and Ithaca than in the earlier parts of Odysseus' story. To be sure, Dante could doubtless have found out rather more if he had been willing to dig more deeply into the various Latin and vernacular accounts of the Trojan tales that circulated in medieval Italy and were probably available to him. But he chose instead to confine himself to the most important and most reliable sources, especially Ovid's Metamorphoses, perhaps out of a sense of historical scruple, surely, however, also because thereby he was free to imagine his own ending to that story. Dante's ignorance about just where, having lost his way, Ulysses went to die, is a lack of knowledge not just about some minor detail of Ulysses' life, but about its most important fact. For in Dante's eyes, how a person's story ends makes indisputably clear the moral qualities that he or she possessed throughout the course of the events recounted in that story. The embarrassment provoked by such an ignorance concerning a figure as important to ancient poetry and history as Ulysses surely helps to explain the overwhelming desire Dante feels to find out more. You see how eagerly I lean in its direction. And yet, we cannot but feel there is something excessive, hyperbolic about the force of this desire. But Virgil praises and accepts Dante's request and asks Ulysses how he died. Ulysses answers with his celebrated account of how he and his small crew sailed out beyond the limits of the columns of Heracles into the southern hemisphere of the earth, eventually capsizing and drowning within sight of an enormous mountain. The story of Ulysses' voyage does not explain what Ulysses was punished for. Virgil has already indicated the crimes for which he is suffering endless torment in a definitive catalog: the Trojan horse, Achilles' betrayal of Deidamia, the theft of the Palladium. Thus, Ulysses' voyage is not a sin, or at least it is not the sin for which he is being punished. Ulysses' narration of it is the answer to Dante's unspoken question, but of course, at the same time, it is a supremely appropriate expression of Ulysses' essential character. That character displays remarkable similarities to Dante's own character, especially as it manifests itself in this very canto. Ulysses' intense curiosity is much like Dante's own intense curiosity. Ulysses' desire to go beyond the geographical limits, whose validity he nonetheless recognizes, is mirrored in the way in which Dante almost loses his balance and falls down, so great is his desire to see these shades. And in the hyperbolic accumulation of his rhetorically finished, yet at the same time passionate prayer to Virgil. Clearly, Dante's curiosity is directed to someone to whom he bears a special affinity, hence the intensity of his desire. Nonetheless, Virgil does not allow Dante to satisfy this desire directly. On the one hand, he grants him his wish to find out how Ulysses died, but on the other, he insists to him that he himself, Virgil, must mediate any contact between Dante and Ulysses, as in this miniature of the 14th century. The justification that Virgil gives for his intervention has puzzled many readers and commentators. What Virgil says is, "Leave speech to me, for I have understood just what you want. And since they are Greeks, they might feel reluctant about your words. Che sarebbero schivi, perché for Greci, forse del tuo detto." This justification has puzzled many readers and commentators. Why should the fact that Diomedes and Ulysses are Greek mean that they would react to Dante's words with reluctance? Scivi doesn't mean disdain, but reluctance. Surely it is not because Dante speaks Italian. So does Virgil, including his address to Ulysses. And for that matter, so too does Ulysses himself. Is it because Dante is from Florence, a city founded by Romans and hence ultimately by Trojans, whereas Virgil's native town of Mantua was founded by a Greek priestess? But nothing in this passage suggests that the origin of their cities is of the slightest relevance here. How would Ulysses be able to tell? And what effect could this origin possibly have upon Dante's language? And why should Ulysses, who is always so curious to learn everything he can about all the men of this whole world, react with scorn to someone just because he came from a certain Italian town? At least until recently, most scholars have preferred a different interpretive strategy. They cite the words of an anonymous contemporary of Dante's, referred to by modern scholars as the Anonimo Genovese, according to whom quasi ogni Greco per comune e lairaor neco e superbo. Almost every Greek in general is a barker, wicked, and proud. They apply these words to Dante's texts, and they conclude that the Greeks would not answer him because they are haughty. As we saw earlier, this is exactly the same tactic which was tried in the case of the sonnet with which we began. Yet here too, I do not find the result at all convincing. What reason is there to suppose that Dante shared the views of his anonymous contemporary, or could presuppose them as being so widespread among his readers that he did not need to explain them himself any further? Why is haughtiness alone chosen from the three different characteristics mentioned by the Anonimo Genovese to the exclusion of the other two? Why, if the Greeks are always haughty, should they react to Dante with scorn, but not to Virgil? And above all, how can arrogance possibly be a defining characteristic peculiar to Ulysses or the Greeks here, given that almost all the criminals in Inferno are depicted as being proud and haughty? Surely it is preferable to assume that Dante will in general try to explain his meaning to his readers, and therefore to search for an answer to the question in the information supplied by the text itself. If we do, we will find that Virgil, in speaking to the two Greek heroes, justifies his request to them with appeal to the high quality of his own poetry, which he wrote during his life, and which he immortalized, in which he immortalized them by making mention of them. The crucial point is Virgil's lofty poetic style, his alti versi, which stands in the sharpest possible contrast with a humble, vernacular, comic level of diction characteristic of Dante's Commedia. Ulysses and Diomedes, being Greeks, will find contemptible or off-putting such a low stylistic register as Dante's own if he should address them. They will respond only to an elevated diction like Virgil's, which they will admire for its beauty. We might say that, being Greeks, Diomedes and Ulysses would be likely to pay much more attention to the aesthetic quality of a discourse addressed to them than to its moral or religious substance. If so, we can begin to understand why it should be precisely in the eighth bolgia of the eighth circle of Dante's Hell that these two Greek heroes should figure, for this is the place assigned to fraudulent counselors. A counselor is someone who is a consummate master of discourse, someone capable of persuading other people to do whatever he wishes by merely verbal means. Someone who is fraudulent is not guided by the proper moral and religious values in his choice of the ends to which he directs his actions and those of other people. The Greeks, who were unsurpassed masters of discourse, were at the same time the Greeks who were not led to salvation by Christian faith. Where could they possibly be placed more appropriately than among the fraudulent counselors? This is not to say, of course, that all Greeks were fraudulent counselors. Aristotle and Homer, for example, were certainly not. But Aristotle and Homer were not typical Greeks. They were among the very best of the Achaeans, as it were. They were exceptions, limit cases. For Dante, fraudulent counsel is, if not a universally Greek trait, in some sense, a typically Greek one. Ulysses, who already in antiquity was both celebrated for his eloquence and notorious for his duplicity, is the most perfect possible expression of these two quintessentially Greek qualities. He represents the extreme limit of human language, unguided by Christian faith. It is not accidental that his speech to his crew, short as it is so effective that he could scarcely have held them back even if he had wished to. Ulysses's curiosity, is intense and passionate, but it is restricted to this world and to the human beings who may or may not be in it. He has no idea that this world is not the only one. He knows that humans are different from animals, but he does not recognize that humans, to be fully comprehended, must also be understood in their difference from the Christian God, whom he never mentions or acknowledges with even a single word in his whole speech. He is constantly pursuing what he calls virtute, virtue, but he is unaware of the fact that pagan virtue is not the only kind of virtue, and that there might be something else, which could be called Christian virtue, which is very different and much higher. He dies within sight of a mountain, which is for him nothing other than that, the highest mountain he has ever seen, brown with distance. Yet we know, what he never recognizes, that it is the mountain of purgatory. He drowns when his boat is submerged by the will of some power, he knows not what, come altrui piaque. We know, what he does not, that this is the God of the Christians. Ulysses' words will be echoed closely by Dante when he himself succeeds in reaching purgatory, which Ulysses never reached, and at the same time he will make an unmistakable reference to Ulysses' failure to reach that goal. Si cum altrui piaque. For Dante, unlike Ulysses, is guided by Christian faith. That is why, near the conclusion of Paradiso, when Dante looks down in retrospect on the whole world in which the voyage he is now concluding has taken place, he will define its limits by reference to the voyage of Ulysses, thus in Paradiso 27. And is why Dante can take up the Ovidian metaphor for the ship of poetry and apply it to his own movement at the beginning of Purgatorio, beyond the limits of Inferno, to a broad new sea. There is indeed danger in his metaphorical sailing too, but as he will clearly indicate near the beginning of Paradiso, he is guided and protected on his path by God. In all these ways, Dante is very much like Ulysses, but with one essential difference. Ulysses has Dante's eloquence and can even surpass it, but he does not have Dante's religious faith. The whole difference can be expressed in the fact that when Dante saw Ulysses and the other shades, he almost fell, but did not, for he grasped a saving rock. Dante surely wished his readers to be reminded of Jesus' words to St. Peter, "And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the powers of death shall not prevail against it." While Ulysses did indeed fall, together with his ship and crew, into the sea which closed up above them. This is not a small difference, but an essential one. No theological, historical, or philosophical necessity obliged Dante to conceive Ulysses so vividly or to introduce him into his poem at all, let alone so conspicuously. If he has chosen to do so, it can only be because he wanted to imagine what it would have been like to have his own, Dante's, gift of extraordinary eloquence, indeed, to possess it in an even higher degree than he himself had it, but at the same time to be entirely devoid of the saving grace of Christian revelation. Dante imagines Ulysses not only as the supreme expression of a specific quality of Greekness, which provokes in him both intense admiration and intense anxiety, but also as an instrument with which better to understand himself, his own virtues and limits. That is to say, Ulysses is not really about Ulysses, he is about Dante. We may understand him, though of course Dante would never have agreed with this, as a fiction that Dante devised in order to comprehend himself. That is why Dante takes care to assert that both back then, meeting Ulysses, and also later, writing the Commedia, he feels pain and constrains himself more than he is accustomed to, lest he destroy his divine gifts by not confining them within the limits of divine virtue. We may call Ulysses Dante's dark twin. One sign of Dante's genius was the power with which he was able to imagine him, empathetically evoke him, and unhesitatingly condemn him. We may now be in a better position to return to the sonnet with which we began, and to ask just what it means for Dante to say that melancholy answers like a Greek. In his sonnet, Dante asks melancholy, clearly and unequivocally, to go away and leave him alone, but she doesn't. Instead of doing what he asks of her, or of entering into a genuine conversation with him, she embarks upon a monological discourse in which she is evidently entirely at her ease, a grande agio, in line 7, though we have little reason to believe that Dante, the listener, is as well. There is an evident contrast between Melancholy's behavior and that of Love, who upon his arrival immediately responds to Dante's question, line 12, with a short and friendly answer, lines 13 to 14, and otherwise displays compassion and sympathy for both Dante and Beatrice. Thus, we can be fairly certain that when Dante says that Melancholy responded to him like a Greek, he means that Melancholy answered with a kind of discourse typical of Greeks, a sustained and eloquent speech, remarkable for its verbal eloquence and presented at some length by a confident master rhetorician, a grande agio, but at the same time entirely devoid of any trace of Christian virtue or redemptive faith, and hence, in a certain sense, treacherous, or at least crafty. After all, Melancholy is certainly deceiving Dante when she claims that she only wants to stay with him for a little while, but then launches into a sustained discourse at her leisure. Melancholy speaks not in order to save Dante's soul, but in order to display the meretricious fireworks of her own linguistic brilliance. We might say that she represents a fallen rhetoric, a pagan poetic idiom. Well, what then of Love? What does Love represent in Dante's poem, and what is his relationship to Melancholy? Here, matters are not so simple. Two interpretative paths stand open before us, and it is not easy to choose between them. On the first road, Amore represents Christian love and ultimately rescues Dante from the mortally perilous temptation of melancholy. For the Middle Ages, melancholy, though not itself a sin, being a humoral disposition, is nonetheless very closely allied with sin. As for love, love takes many forms in Dante's world, but at its best, it is the sole and sufficient source of all our virtues and all our blessings. And it is at its very best when this is a noble love for a noble object, as, for example, in the case of Dante's love for Beatrice. So love, on this first reading, may be taken to point in a potentially more virtuous and ultimately redemptive direction than melancholy possibly could. If we see the poem in this light, we may understand Dante's sonnet as being far more dramatic even than it might at first have seemed. Melancholy's arrival represents the threat of a deadly sin to Dante's spiritual well-being. He attempts to save himself from her, but he fails to, for she answers him like a Greek. When Love does arrive, he will rescue Dante from an exclusive and paralyzing absorption with himself and direct his attention instead towards another person, one who ultimately will save him, namely Beatrice. But when Love goes on to tell Dante that Beatrice is dying, the shock is all the greater. This first interpretive path has its evident attractions, yet it is not free from obstacles and difficulties that may point us in another direction altogether. For just how spiritual is this love after all? Can we be sure that he represents redemptive Christian charity and not sinful carnal passion? And is he not here himself deeply affected by melancholy? Do not his garb, behavior, and words demonstrate that he is not so much an alternative to melancholy, who can rescue Dante from her, as rather a further embodiment or even intensification of melancholy's power? After all, the first part of melancholy's name means black in Greek, and the only figure in the sonnet to whom this color is attributed is Love, who is dressed in a new black cloak, line 9. Where exactly is Dante looking when he sees Love? Perhaps not into the far distance, whence we might expect his salvation to come, but instead still at Melancholy and her retinue, whose arrival at the beginning of the poem had imposed upon his visual field. The poem gives us no reason to think that in the meantime he has shifted his glance in any other direction. If so, then Love may well be accompanying melancholy together with grief and anger. Dressed in black, weeping, saying sad words, Love may not only be implicated in melancholy, but form part, indeed the climactic part of her entourage. And if this is the case, then Love would represent not a saving Christian rhetoric, but rather a sinful pagan form of erotic discourse. Ovid, let us say, instead of Augustine. And Dante's sonnet would dramatize not an emotionally painful salvation, but a spiritually perilous dilemma. Thus, within the conceptual structure of the poem, an unsettling dehiscence opens up. On one side of it stands melancholy, speaking like a Greek, but is Love standing on the same side together with her, or not rather on the opposite side? We remain quite unsure, but we cannot have it both ways. About the status of melancholy, Dante seems to have no doubts. She is only a Greek. But about love, Dante seems less univocal, more self-divided. Perhaps our own uncertainty, faced by the necessary but impossible choice between these two incompatible interpretive paths, reflects an uncertainty in Dante himself regarding the status and validity of his own love poetry at this time. Un di si venia me malinconia is a sonnet that Dante excluded from his Vita Nuova. Why? Only because of its slight metrical irregularity, the anomalous rhythm of verse 9, and grammatical inconsonity? Or also because Dante could not in the end be entirely certain that within this poem he had succeeded in achieving a standpoint outside the allures of melancholy, which would allow him to condemn and escape her once and for all. Melancholy, answered Dante like a Greek. At the time he wrote this sonnet, several decades before his encounter with Ulysses in the underworld, could Dante be quite sure that he himself, Dante, was not a Greek too? I thank you very much, and I wish you good cheer and good health. I hope to see you in Athens someday soon. Bye-bye.